a move that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in 72 hours. 72 hours that reshaped the battlefield, 72 hours that exposed cracks in the Western alliance, 72 hours that forced Ukraine to act alone. What the Kremlin did this week crossed a line that Washington had desperately hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Kyiv did not hesitate. They responded with precision, ferocity, and a level of coordination that caught even Moscow off guard. But here's what makes this story so extraordinary and so deeply troubling. When the Kremlin made its move, Washington went silent, not cautious, not diplomatic, silent. And in that silence, Ukraine found its answer. They would not wait for permission. They would not wait for consensus. They would strike. For several weeks now, there have been signals, not official communications, not formal diplomatic channels, just signals that Moscow was preparing something unprecedented. The Kremlin has been aggressive, yes, but they have been methodical in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a predictability, almost a choreography. But what set off alarm bells in Langley and Brussels this week was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military communications know the indicators, the encrypted bursts between forward operating bases, the supply chain movements along key rail corridors, the repositioning of mobile air defense systems, the sudden increase in electronic warfare signatures. All of that went quiet. And whenever the Kremlin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Senior officials at the Pentagon began requesting hourly updates. NATO's Intelligence Fusion Center in Belgium went to heightened alert status. And in Kyiv, President Zelensky's war cabinet began meeting around the clock. Everyone sensed it. Something was coming. But no one, not even the most experienced Russia watchers, predicted what the Kremlin was actually planning. Early Tuesday morning, U.S. reconnaissance assets detected what they described as unprecedented force concentration along the Zaporizhzhia axis, including armored columns that had not been repositioned in over 14 months. These are the kinds of assets that Russia only moves when they are signaling something very specific, a major offensive, a strategic feint, or a provocation designed to fracture Western unity. NATO observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once, but what they did know was that Moscow was changing its strategic posture. And when a nuclear power shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest margin, every capital in the West pays attention. What made this particular movement so alarming wasn't just the scale, though the scale was significant, it was the composition. Mixed into the armored columns were systems that Russia had previously kept in reserve: next-generation electronic warfare platforms, mobile missile systems capable of striking deep into NATO territory, and, most concerning of all, tactical delivery vehicles that could theoretically carry non-conventional payloads. This wasn't a routine rotation. This was a message, and the message was clear. The Kremlin was prepared to escalate. The warning issued by the State Department tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after official, briefing after briefing, described Moscow's move as destabilizing, calculated, and perhaps most importantly, designed to test whether the West would fracture under pressure. But strategic intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most aggressive and coordinated we've seen in this entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of detecting Russia's force movements, Ukrainian forces launched a series of deep strikes across multiple Russian-held territories. These weren't the standard artillery salvos we've grown accustomed to seeing. These were precision-guided, intelligence-driven operations, systems and tactics that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to fundamentally alter the battlefield equation. They hit command nodes, they hit logistics hubs, they hit ammunition depots that had been identified weeks ago but deliberately left untouched. Why? Because Ukraine was waiting. They were waiting for the Kremlin to overextend. And when Moscow made its move, Kyiv struck. Tonight, multiple sources confirmed that Ukraine launched simultaneous strikes on at least 17 Russian military positions, including a forward command center that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was a major spring offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate. They hit fuel depots in Luhansk. They hit radar installations near Mariupol. They hit staging areas in Crimea that were likely preparing to support an amphibious thrust. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's planned operation, the infrastructure that would have made it possible, the logistics that would have sustained it, the command structure that would have directed it. This is what made Washington's silence so conspicuous. The Kremlin's gambit wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of escalation that could fundamentally alter the trajectory of this war if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't chase propaganda victories. They didn't strike civilian areas for symbolic retaliation. They hit military infrastructure. They hit operational capability. And they did it with a speed and precision that suggests months of planning and perhaps intelligence support that hasn't been publicly acknowledged. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence analysts now believe that the Kremlin's latest move was designed to probe the cohesion of Western support after months of political uncertainty in Washington and wavering commitment in several European capitals. Moscow wanted to see whether NATO would hesitate, whether Washington would equivocate, whether Ukraine would be left to twist in the wind. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't wait for permission. They launched a response that was so immediate, so devastating, that even Moscow's normally stoic military bloggers noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But today, Kyiv did. Defense analysts speaking with European media under strict anonymity described Moscow's shift as coercive signaling, a way to test resolve while maintaining plausible deniability. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and willing to respond in kind. Their strikes were not only militarily significant, they were timed so precisely that Russia's air defenses in several sectors were caught in transition between defensive postures. That timing matters because it shows something crucial. It shows that Ukraine has penetrated Russia's operational security. It shows that Kyiv is not merely reacting to Moscow's moves, they're anticipating them. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian drone units carried out coordinated attacks on 3 separate ammunition storage facilities, forcing Russian forces to disperse reserves that were earmarked for offensive operations. Special operations teams targeted a rail junction that had been reinforced in the last 72 hours, suggesting real-time intelligence on Russian logistics. Naval drones operating in the Black Sea reportedly struck or severely damaged at least 2 Russian naval auxiliary vessels used by Moscow to resupply its Crimean garrison. This wasn't just retaliation, this wasn't just defense, this was strategic disruption, this was operational paralysis. And operational paralysis is the one thing Russia has struggled to overcome since the earliest days of this war. For every advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates consolidation. For every territory they've seized, Ukraine has made them pay in blood and equipment. And today, Ukraine proved that even when Washington goes quiet, Kyiv does not. Remember, Moscow thought this war would last 72 hours. They thought Kyiv would fall within a week. They thought Zelensky would flee, the government would collapse, and the West would accept a fait accompli. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is striking deeper into Russian-held territory than ever before. Western weapons, regardless of Washington's current silence, are being used with devastating effectiveness, and the Kremlin is facing the uncomfortable reality that this war has no clean exit. Every assumption Moscow made at the outset of this conflict has been proven wrong, and yet, instead of recalibrating, Putin is doubling down. That's what makes this moment so dangerous. What makes this moment so critical and so volatile is that the Kremlin's latest move happened at a time when Putin is under extraordinary domestic pressure. Hardliners in the military want faster results. Ultranationalist voices want total mobilization. Economic advisors want a negotiated settlement before sanctions cause irreversible damage. And security services want to avoid the kind of catastrophic miscalculation that could threaten the regime itself. Putin is balancing these demands while prosecuting a war that has already cost Russia more than 200,000 casualties. And when leaders in that position make sudden aggressive moves, they're not doing it from strength, they're doing it from pressure, they're doing it from vulnerability, they're doing it because standing still is no longer an option. The State Department's advisory, now circulating among allied governments, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow Moscow's escalation to go unanswered. Senior officials said plainly that Russia's force movements were inconsistent with any defensive posture and represented deliberate provocation. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing and we're not going to pretend otherwise. You don't usually hear that tone from Foggy Bottom unless something serious is at stake. And yet, and this is the part that has allies deeply concerned, Washington's public response has been muted. Press briefings have been short, official statements have been carefully hedged, and the White House has been notably reluctant to comment on Ukraine's retaliatory strikes. That silence is not accidental, it's strategic, but whether it's strategic wisdom or strategic paralysis remains an open question. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky addressed his nation in a resolute, defiant speech tonight. He said, "We did not choose this war, but we will choose how it ends." He said, "When our partners hesitate, we act. When the world watches, we fight." And he said, Russia expected silence. They received their answer in fire and steel. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky knows that Ukraine's survival depends not only on Western support, but on demonstrating that Ukraine can act independently when that support wavers. And today, Ukraine demonstrated exactly that. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. The Kremlin's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the force concentration in Zaporizhia, Belarusian military units also began exercises near the Ukrainian border, exercises that were not previously announced. Russian naval forces in the Black Sea increased patrol activity near Ukrainian shipping lanes. Cyber operations targeting Ukrainian government infrastructure increased by over 300% in the last 72 hours. All of this happened within the same window. When Moscow moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. It means the Kremlin is attempting to create confusion, to stretch Ukrainian defenses, to force Kyiv into reactive mode. But Ukraine didn't react. Ukraine anticipated. And that distinction may prove to be the most important strategic development of this entire week. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that the Kremlin is preparing for a renewed spring offensive, using intimidation tactics to fix Ukrainian forces in place before striking elsewhere. Another is that Moscow is attempting to fracture Western unity by demonstrating that escalation carries no real consequences. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to create conditions for a frozen conflict using aggressive posturing to force negotiations on his terms. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for diplomatic cover. They didn't wait for allied consensus. They didn't wait for Washington to find its voice. They struck. And in striking, they sent a message that no amount of Kremlin posturing will go unanswered. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Moscow wants to see whether the West will fracture under sustained pressure. Ukraine wants to show that it can win this war, with or without consistent Allied support. NATO wants to prevent escalation from spiraling beyond Ukraine's borders, and Washington wants to prevent a direct confrontation while maintaining enough ambiguity to preserve diplomatic options. These objectives are not always compatible, and in the space between them, Ukraine must fight. Tonight, we've heard from European defense officials who are now monitoring Russian repositioning in response to Ukraine's strikes. They say preliminary assessments suggest significant damage to Russian logistics networks. They say Moscow's planned timeline, whatever it was, has almost certainly been disrupted. And they say the Kremlin's decision to concentrate forces so visibly was likely part of a broader intimidation strategy intended to deter Western escalation. But Ukraine is not deterred. In fact, Ukraine is emboldened. Their response today, swift, precise, and strategically devastating, sent a message to Moscow that aggression will be met with counterpunches. And it sent a message to Washington that Ukraine will not wait forever for leadership that isn't coming. As the week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly the Kremlin hoped to achieve with this gambit. But what we do know is that Ukraine's response was timely. It disrupted Russian planning, it demonstrated operational capability, and it reminded the world that Ukraine remains in this fight, regardless of the political weather in Washington. What happens next will depend on what Moscow does in the coming days. If they escalate further, this moment will be remembered as a turning point. If they recalibrate, Ukraine and its Western backers have already shown they are prepared for either scenario. They have shown they are ready to respond, and they have shown that silence from one capital does not mean silence from all. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be genuinely uncertain. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when the Kremlin is quiet after a move like this, it means they are recalculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Moscow learned something they have learned many times before, but perhaps never so painfully, that Ukraine does not break. That Western weapons in Ukrainian hands are devastatingly effective. And silence from Washington does not mean surrender from Kyiv. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear: the Kremlin's gambit did not produce the reaction they expected. Ukraine's fury was real, and it was felt, and Washington's silence may have spoken louder than any statement could, and we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.